Lucas had been trapped for months in a cycle that seemed to have no end. The death of Clara, his wife, had left a void that he didn't know how to fill. Every day was the same in the remote house where they had planned a peaceful life, surrounded by the forest. Now, that tranquility was suffocating him. Lucas spent his nights awake, avoiding sleep, but exhaustion always ended up overcoming him. When sleep finally overcame him, Clara would appear. In his dreams, she was always on the other side of a forest trail. Her face, although familiar, seemed distant, almost unreachable. She would call to him, with the same soft voice that he loved, and Lucas would always start to follow her, but he could never reach her before waking up. It was as if he were condemned to relive that moment of loss every night. At first, Lucas believed that the dreams were just a manifestation of his grief, a way for his mind to process the pain. He didn't talk to anyone. Not that there were many people to talk to. Since Clara's death, he had completely isolated himself. Friends had tried to reach out, but he had distanced himself, preferring solitude to the empty empathy that seemed incomprehensible in the face of the immensity of his loss. However, something in the dreams bothered him. The trail Clara had led him on was strangely real, full of details he couldn't ignore. The trees, the rocks, the sounds of the forest, everything seemed so familiar. When Lucas woke up, he always felt like he knew that place. But that didn't make sense. Or did it? The next morning, after another dream in which Clara called him from the trail, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling of familiarity from his mind. Those details, the outlines of the trees, the bushes around, seemed like a reflection of something real. He wondered if it was possible that the trail in his dreams really existed. Driven by this uncomfortable idea, Lucas decided to explore the forest around the house. It was a cloudy morning, the air humid and heavy. He grabbed his coat and went outside, passing through the yard that Clara loved to tend so much. The flowers were wilted now, left to their own devices, just like him. Walking through the trees, he followed a path he had not visited for a long time. The forest had always seemed peaceful to him, but now there was something different about it. The silence was oppressive, as if nature itself was holding its breath, watching him. As he walked, an uncomfortable thought arose. What if he really found the trail? Then, Lucas stopped suddenly. There, in front of him, was the trail. The same trail he had been walking in his dreams. Every curve, every detail, was identical. He stood still, unable to believe it. It was as if his dreams had materialized before his eyes. He took a few steps into the trail, his heart racing. The familiarity was unsettling, almost supernatural. He looked around, expecting to find Clara at any moment, as in his dreams. But the trail was empty, silent. Yet, something about that trail seemed to call to him, as if there was a purpose in following it, a mystery that needed to be solved. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but decided to go back. Something kept him from going any further, an instinctive fear. Still, he knew he couldn't ignore what he had found. In the days that followed the discovery of the trail, Lucas began to notice changes around him, small things that soon became impossible to ignore. The house, previously silent and empty, began to show signs of something more. The first night after his walk through the forest, he woke to the sound of footsteps downstairs. He went downstairs cautiously, expecting to find some animal that had entered through the open window, but the house was as usual, empty. However, things that had previously been in a specific place had moved. The painting of Clara, which he kept in the living room, was slightly crooked. A cup that he had left on the table was now on the kitchen counter. Were these just distractions, or was he really losing touch with reality? Lucas tried to ignore these details, but the nights became increasingly restless. The dreams about Clara became more intense. Now she called to him more urgently, with an expression of anguish on her face that he had never seen before. She was not just leading him along the trail. She was begging him to follow her, as if something terrible were coming. He began to wake up to the sound of her voice echoing through the house, even after his eyes were open. On more than one occasion, he swore he had glimpsed Clara's figure, standing at the edge of the forest, watching him through the window. But whenever he looked closer, there was nothing. Lucas began to feel like he was going crazy. The line between what was real and what were just fragments of his dreams was blurring. The trail, the house, Clara, everything seemed connected, and the line between grief and the supernatural grew ever thinner. That night, Lucas's sleep was even more restless than usual. He dreamed of Clara again, but this time, the setting was different. The air was thick and heavy, and the trail, which had previously seemed just an ordinary path through the forest, now had an oppressive atmosphere. The trees seemed taller, their shadows darker, and Clara was there, closer, but her face held a deep despair. She no longer smiled. Instead, her eyes were empty, as if something had drained her of all her vitality. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice echoing in a way that seemed to come from within the forest itself. "You must follow me to the end. It's the only way to know the truth." Lucas's heart clenched in his chest. There was an urgency in her voice that he had never heard before. He tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but his voice would not come out. He followed her, as he did in every dream. But this time, Clara did not stop in the middle of the trail. She led him deeper into the forest, to a place he had never seen before. Ahead, an ancient tree stood out from the rest, its bark thick and twisted. There was something wrong with this tree, something terribly wrong. As he got closer, Lucas noticed red stains running down the bark, blood. His body froze in fear, but Clara kept walking toward the tree, as if it were inevitable. "My death," Clara began, but her voice sounded strangely distorted. It wasn't an accident. Lucas felt his heart stop. He shook his head in disbelief. This didn't make sense. Clara had died in a car accident. He was sure of it. But then, why was she saying that? "You know what happened," Clara said, with an intensity that burned in her eyes. "But you're forgetting. You let it slip away." He woke up abruptly, his body covered in cold sweat. The echo of Clara's words continued to resonate in his mind. It wasn't an accident. There was a hidden truth, buried somewhere inside him. But what was it? Lucas knew he had to get back on the trail. This time, in real life. Determined to find out what Clara was trying to show him, Lucas got ready the next morning. The sky was covered in dark clouds, foreshadowing a storm, but that wouldn't stop him. He knew what he had to do. Get back on the trail and find that tree. The dream, still fresh in his memory, guided him like a compass. Each step seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if the forest itself resisted his presence. After walking for almost an hour, Lucas reached the tree. It was exactly as it had been in the dream. The twisted bark and blood stains were there, just as he had seen them. The air around it seemed colder, and the forest was filled with an absolute, almost unnatural silence. Before he could get any closer, something moved in the corner of his vision. He turned quickly and saw Clara, but she was not the same Clara from his previous dreams. There was something deeply wrong with her. Her face was distorted, as if time and pain had consumed her beauty. Her eyes, which had once held love and longing, now reflected anger and resentment. "Why did you leave me?" her voice sounded, but not human. It was more like a bitter whisper, carried by the wind. Lucas tried to answer, but the words stuck in his throat. He had never left her. At least, that was what he had always believed. But doubt began to gnaw at his mind. What had he forgotten? He sensed that there was something deeper in his guilt, something he had blocked out. Clara approached, her pale skin contrasting with the dark background of the forest. When she reached out toward him, Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. She pulled him closer to the tree, as if she wanted him to merge with that grotesque trunk. He tried to resist, but her strength was surprising. For a moment, he glimpsed something lurking in the shadows of the tree, a presence far more sinister than Clara herself. With a last effort, Lucas managed to free himself and stumbled backwards, falling onto the leaf-covered ground. Clara disappeared in an instant, as if she had never been there, but the sensation of her cold hand still burned his skin. Lucas's breathing was heavy, terror taking over. Something far more terrible than he had imagined lived on that trail. Lucas stumbled back home, his body and mind in tatters. The forest seemed larger, darker, as if it were alive and aware of his presence. Everything he had seen on the trail, Clara, the tree, the sinister presence lurking, seemed to haunt his thoughts, unable to be left behind. Inside the house, the silence was quickly replaced by a growing sense of despair. Clara's words, "You left me," echoed in his mind like a painful mantra. Lucas sat on the living room floor, his eyes lost somewhere in the void. Had he missed something? Had he somehow been responsible for Clara's death? What had once seemed like a tragic accident now became a constant doubt. He tried to recall the events of that fateful day, but everything was shrouded in a haze, as if his memory refused to cooperate. Clara was right. There was something he had blocked out, but he couldn't remember what. Each time he tried, the guilt suffocated him even more. The nights became even more disturbing. The dreams returned, but Clara no longer called him to the trail. Now, she watched him from a distance, her face full of pain and resentment, while whispers echoed around him, accusing him. Lucas was trapped in an endless cycle of doubt and terror. The trail still called to him, and he knew that one day he would have to return to face the truth, or be consumed by it. But for now, he stood there, paralyzed, unable to distinguish whether the real monster was the forest, the guilt, or himself.